The door to the sheriff's office burst open so hard that the wanted posters rattled on the wall, and the oil lamp on Andrew Graves's desk swayed like a drunk man on a Saturday night. He was halfway through a cold cup of coffee when she came in, and the moment he saw her face, every instinct honed by 8 years wearing a badge screamed at him that something was desperately, catastrophically wrong. Beatrice Sutton stood in the doorway of the Coldwater Creek Sheriff's Office on a Tuesday evening in October of 1878, and she looked like a woman who had been carrying the weight of the entire frontier on her shoulders for so long that her knees were finally, irreversibly buckling. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and fell across her face in wild strands. Her hands were shaking. Her dress, which had once been a fine deep blue, was torn at the hem and dusted with the pale red clay of the Texas panhandle. There was a bruise forming at the edge of her jaw that Andrew could see even in the low amber light of the lamp, and it made something hot and dangerous surge through his chest. He was on his feet before she could speak a single word. "Miss," he said, his voice measured and low, the kind of tone he used when a situation was balanced on the edge of a knife. "Come inside, close the door." She stepped in. She closed the door. She turned to face him, and he saw in her eyes something he recognized from his darkest cases, the expression of a person who has been holding a secret so enormous and so terrible that they have begun to physically crack under its weight. It was the look of a woman who had run out of options, a woman who had run out of people to trust, a woman who had, out of sheer desperation, walked into the office of a man she did not know and decided that this was it. This was her last chance. "I need to tell you something," she said, and her voice was steadier than he expected, which told him she had rehearsed this. She had practiced it 100 times on the road getting here. "And I need you to promise me something first." Andrew Graves pulled out the chair across from his desk, the one he usually reserved for nervous witnesses, and gestured to it. "Sit down first," he said. "Tell me after." No, she did not move. Her eyes held his with a ferocity that surprised him. "You promise me first. Promise me that when I tell you what I know, you will not walk out that door to go handle it yourself before I've finished talking. Promise me you'll stay until I've said everything I need to say." He studied her for a moment. The bruise, the shaking hands, the torn dress, the eyes that were full of something that looked like terror wrapped in iron determination. "Tell me everything," he said quietly. "I'm not leaving." Something in her face shifted then, like a wall that had been holding back a flood finally surrendering its last brick, and she sat down in that chair and began to speak. And Andrew Graves, who had heard confessions and accusations and dying declarations and desperate pleas in this very office, pulled his own chair around to face her rather than retreating behind the safety of his desk, and he listened. But to understand what she told him that night, and why it mattered so much more than either of them could have guessed when she walked through that door, you have to understand what the preceding 3 weeks had looked like for Beatrice Sutton, and what kind of woman she was before the town of Coldwater Creek, and its complicated, quietly handsome sheriff changed the entire course of her life. Beatrice had come west from St. Louis in the summer of 1878, which meant she had arrived in the Texas Panhandle when the heat was at its most merciless, and the dust never fully settled. She was 26 years old and recently widowed, though widowed was perhaps a generous word for what her situation had been. Her husband, Gerald Sutton, had died of a fever in April, and while she had mourned appropriately, she had also, in the private architecture of her own heart, felt a complicated and guilty relief. Gerald had been a man of sharp edges and sharper tempers, and the marriage had been arranged by her father when she was 19 for reasons that had more to do with business interests than with love. She had survived 7 years of it. She had not flourished. When Gerald died and left her with a modest inheritance and no children and no compelling reason to remain in St. Louis, Beatrice had done something that most of the women in her social circle considered scandalous, and most of the women outside her social circle considered admirable. She had packed 2 trunks, sold the house, and boarded a train west. Her plan had been straightforward and, she believed, sensible. She had answered a legitimate advertisement placed in the St. Louis Dispatch by a land surveying company in the Texas Panhandle, offering clerical work to a woman with education and organizational abilities. The company was called the Hargrove Land and Settlement Association, and the advertisement had been signed by a man named Calvin Hargrove, who described himself as a reputable businessman working to bring proper settlement infrastructure to the frontier territories. The first warning sign had appeared before she even arrived, though she had not recognized it as such at the time. The letter of confirmation she received back from the Hargrove Land and Settlement Association had been effusive in a way that felt slightly off, overpromising her comfortable lodgings, good wages, and the company of other respectable women employees. But she had been eager to leave and had dismissed her unease as the anxiety of a woman unaccustomed to making her own decisions. She had arrived in Coldwater Creek on a Thursday in late August, stepping off the stage with her 2 trunks and her leather satchel, and the address she had been given written on a folded piece of paper in her coat pocket. Coldwater Creek was a proper frontier town by 1878 standards, meaning it had a main street wide enough for wagons to pass each other, a general store, a land office, a hotel, a barber shop, a saloon, 2 churches of differing denominations that regarded each other with mild theological suspicion, and a sheriff's office with a small jail attached to the back. She had not gone to the sheriff's office that first day. She had gone to the address on the paper, which turned out to be a large clapboard building on the eastern edge of town that had been set up to look like a legitimate office. Calvin Hargrove had met her at the door himself, and he had been on the surface everything the advertisement had suggested, well-dressed for the frontier, pleasant-mannered. He shook her hand and smiled warmly and introduced her to the other women already employed there, 3 of them whose names were Clara, Dottie, and a quiet girl named May who never quite met anyone's eyes. For the first week, everything had seemed fine. The work was clerical as promised. She kept records, organized land documents, wrote correspondence in her neat hand. Coldwater Creek and the surrounding panhandle were in the middle of a significant period of land settlement, with homesteaders filing claims under the provisions of recent federal legislation, and there was genuine paperwork to be managed. She had been good at her job, methodical and precise, and Calvin Hargrove had praised her work warmly. It was during the second week that she began to notice the discrepancies. Small things at first. Documents that referenced land parcels that did not correspond to any legitimate survey maps she could locate. Names on deeds that appeared in multiple places simultaneously, which should have been impossible. Payment records that seemed to show homesteaders paying fees for services that the Territorial Land Office did not recognize as legitimate requirements. She had not said anything. She had simply started paying closer attention. It was Clara who first gave her a real indication of what was happening, and Clara had done it so obliquely and so carefully that Beatrice had almost missed it. They had been alone in the records room late one afternoon when Clara said, without looking up from the file she was organizing, "You're smart enough to see what you're looking at. That means you need to be smart enough to know what not to look at." Beatrice had looked at her. Clara had kept her eyes on the file. "Why are you here?" Beatrice had asked, keeping her voice level. Clara had paused for just a moment. "I owe a debt," she said quietly, "and I'm paying it." She paused again. "You should go home, Miss Sutton. You should go home before you owe one too." But Beatrice had not gone home. Partly because she had nowhere she particularly wanted to go, and partly because something in her, that part that had spent 7 years watching a man use power and money to hurt people, and never being able to do a single thing about it, refused to simply walk away. What Calvin Hargrove and the Hargrove Land and Settlement Association were doing was, as best as she could piece together from 2 weeks of careful, quiet observation, a land fraud operation of significant scale. They were collecting fees from homesteaders under the pretense of processing paperwork that was legally unnecessary. They were filing false land surveys that inflated parcel values and created paper claims that could be sold to investors back east who had no idea they were buying fiction. And most damningly, they were taking advantage of settlers who could not read well enough to understand what they were signing, many of them recent immigrants and freedmen who were attempting to stake legitimate claims, and who trusted that the official-looking Hargrove Land and Settlement Association was what it presented itself to be. This was 1878, and the frontier was full of such schemes. The land rush in the Panhandle had brought both genuine settlers and genuine predators, and the legal infrastructure to distinguish between them was thin and often corrupted. Beatrice knew that what Hargrove was doing was wrong in a way that went far beyond mere inconvenience. People were losing money they could not afford to lose. People were filing claims they believed were legitimate that would be challenged or voided when the underlying documents were discovered to be fraudulent. Families were being built on foundations that had been deliberately engineered to fail. She had made notes, careful, coded notes, written small on pages she kept folded inside the lining of her travel satchel. She had begun making copies of specific documents, the most damning ones, writing them out by hand in the evenings when she was alone in her room at the boarding house where Hargrove had placed her. She had been at this for 2 weeks when things had changed. The change had come on a Monday. She had arrived at the office to find a man she had not seen before sitting in the main room, talking with Hargrove in a low voice. The man was large and had a way of looking at a room that reminded her of how a wolf looked at a flock, systematically and with absolute confidence in the outcome. His name, she later learned, was Wade Prout, and he was Calvin Hargrove's primary enforcer and business partner. Hargrove had introduced her pleasantly and had said nothing that indicated suspicion. But that afternoon, she had noticed that the document she had been copying was not where she had left it, having been moved by perhaps 2 inches on the desk. Someone had looked at it. Someone had noticed her pattern. That evening, coming back from the general store where she had gone to buy ink, she had been stopped on the street by Wade Prout, who had blocked her path with the relaxed confidence of a man who knew exactly how much physical space he commanded. "Miss Sutton," he had said pleasantly, "I hear you're a hard worker, detail-oriented." He had smiled, and the smile had not reached anywhere near his eyes. "Mr. Hargrove is very pleased with your work. He'd be real disappointed if you decided to leave before your contract was up." It had not been a threat in any legally definable sense. But it had been a threat in every real sense, the kind that left no bruise, made no witnesses, and lodged itself like a splinter in the palm of your hand where it would fester quietly until it could no longer be ignored. She had gone back to her room and she had lain awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling of the boarding house while the sounds of Coldwater Creek drifted up from below, horses and voices, and somewhere down the street the tinny piano from the saloon. She had thought about Clara's warning. She had thought about May, who never met anyone's eyes, and about Dottie, who had started her time there with a bright smile that had faded to a kind of quiet flatness that Beatrice recognized as the expression of a person who had given up fighting. She had thought about the homesteaders, the families filing their paperwork and handing over their money, and going back to their parcels of land to build something real out of something false. And she had thought about 7 years of being told that the best thing she could do was be quiet and not cause trouble. She had gotten up and retrieved her notes from the lining of her satchel, and she had spent the remaining dark hours adding everything she had not yet written down. It was the following Sunday, after church, that Prout had found her again. This time, there had been no pleasantries. He had caught her arm as she was walking back to the boarding house and pulled her into the alley beside the feed store with a grip that left the bruise she was now wearing on her jaw. He had been very direct. He knew she had been copying documents. He knew she had been making notes. He gave her until Tuesday evening to hand over everything she had collected, every copy, every note, every scrap of evidence. "You hand it all over and you walk out of this town quiet," he had said. "Or you don't walk out at all." That had been Sunday. It was Tuesday evening now. She had not handed anything over. She had come to the sheriff's office instead. Andrew Graves sat in his chair and listened to all of this without interruption, and the way he listened, the quality of his attention, the absolute stillness of his focus, was something Beatrice had never experienced before. He did not lean back with the skeptical expression of a man deciding how much to believe. He did not lean forward with the eager expression of a man already planning his next move. He simply listened, his dark eyes steady on her face, his hands loosely clasped on his knees, and the lamplight moving softly over his features. He was perhaps 32 or 33 years old, with the weathered look of a man who had spent most of his adult life outside and the kind of quiet internal gravity that did not come from bravado, but from having genuinely faced difficult things and survived them. There was a scar at the edge of his left jaw, barely visible in the low light. He wore his badge on his vest the way some men wore their faith, not ostentatiously, but as a statement of something personally held. When she finished talking, the silence in the room was deep and specific, the silence of a space that has just received something important. "Show me the notes," he said. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the folded pages. She handed them across. He read through them carefully, and she watched his face as he did, and what she saw there was not the disbelief she had half expected, or the condescension she had encountered plenty of times from men who had decided before she opened her mouth that she could not possibly know what she was talking about. What she saw was a man reading a document and recognizing it as serious. "How many families do you estimate have been affected?" he asked, still reading. "At least 42 that I can account for from the records I've seen," she said, "possibly more. Some of the earliest records were filed before I arrived and I haven't had access to all of them. And the document copies you made, where are they now?" "In my satchel," she said. "I brought everything." He looked up from the notes then, and their eyes met directly for the first time since she had sat down, and she felt something that she was not prepared for in the circumstances, a kind of steadiness that passed between them, something that felt like recognition. "Prout gave you until tonight," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "He'll come to the boarding house tonight when you don't show up." "Yes." Andrew set the notes on his desk and stood, and she watched him think, the visible motion of a disciplined mind working through a situation. He walked to the window and looked out at the darkening street of Coldwater Creek, one hand resting on the window frame. She could see his reflection in the glass, and she could see the street behind him, and she could see the lamps being lit in the windows of the shops and the boarding house and the hotel. "You did the right thing coming here," he said, and his voice had a quality to it that she had not heard in a very long time, if ever. He said it plainly, without qualification, the way a person states a fact they are entirely certain of. "This is the right thing and you did it, and I'm going to make sure that means something." Beatrice felt something in her chest unknot that she had not known was knotted. "What happens now?" she asked. He turned from the window. "Now," he said, "you're not going back to that boarding house tonight." He said it in the same matter-of-fact tone, the tone of a man organizing a practical situation rather than making a declaration. "I've got a cell in the back that I use for witnesses sometimes when there's a safety consideration. It locks from the inside and the window's barred. It's not elegant, but it's safe." He paused. "Or there's Mrs. Holly's, who runs the laundry 2 streets over and takes in women who need a quiet place to sleep. She's helped me before." "Mrs. Holly's," Beatrice said without hesitation. The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. "Good choice. I'll take you there." He picked up his hat from the peg on the wall and his coat from the chair by the door. "But first I want you to tell me everything about the physical layout of Hargrove's building. Exits, interior rooms where the records are kept, all of it." So she told him that too, and he listened with the same quality of attention, asking precise and practical questions, and she found to her own slight astonishment that she felt safe. Not in the way she had felt safe sometimes in Gerald's house when he was in a good mood. that precarious, conditional safety that you were always aware could evaporate. This was different. This was the feeling of being in a space where someone had decided, firmly and without reservation, that your welfare mattered. It was unsettling how much it meant to her. Mrs. Hollis was a broad-shouldered black woman of about 50 who opened her door to Andrew's quiet knock with the expression of a person who had learned to read situations very quickly and accurately. She took one look at Beatrice, the bruised jaw, the torn dress, the obvious exhaustion, and stepped back to let her in with no unnecessary questions. She gave Andrew a look that communicated volumes in a brief exchange of glances between two people who had dealt with the consequences of the frontier's rougher elements before. "She'll be fine," Mrs. Hollis said to Andrew, which was both a reassurance and a dismissal. "I know she will," Andrew said. He looked at Beatrice. "I'll come by in the morning, early. Don't go anywhere until I do." "I won't," she said. He nodded once, replaced his hat, and walked back out into the night, and Beatrice watched him go from the doorway of Mrs. Hollis's house and felt, for the second time in the space of an hour, something she had not felt in many years. She felt like the person she was actually supposed to be. Andrew Graves did not sleep that night. He spent part of it reviewing the notes and document copies Beatrice had given him, organizing them with the meticulous care of a man preparing a legal case, which was essentially what he was doing. He had been sheriff of Coldwater Creek for 3 years, appointed by the county and confirmed by popular election, and in that time he had dealt with the usual frontier range of cattle theft, disputed claims, drunken violence, and the occasional more serious crime. He had not dealt with organized land fraud on this scale, but he knew the law regarding it. He had made a point of knowing the law thoroughly and carefully, because he had come to believe that the law was one of the few tools that could actually protect the people who most needed protecting, and he had seen too many instances of it wielded badly to be casual about its proper application. What Beatrice had brought him was not just a complaint, it was a documented case. The document copies she had made were meticulous, the notes were organized and specific, the dates and names and figures were corroborated in multiple places. She had, without legal training and under conditions of genuine personal risk, assembled something that a territorial court could act on. He drafted a wire to the Federal Land Office in Austin. He wrote it carefully, including enough specifics to convey urgency, without including so much that it could compromise the case if the wire was intercepted. He would send it first thing in the morning. He also spent part of the night thinking about Beatrice Sutton, and he was honest with himself about that, which was something he had trained himself to be. He had learned from experience that dishonesty with himself was the most dangerous kind. She had walked into his office frightened and resolute in equal measure, holding a secret that could get her killed, having made the decision to trust a stranger with it, because trusting no one was no longer a survivable option. He had known within the first few minutes of listening to her that she was exactly who she presented herself to be, not because people never lied, but because the lie of self-presentation took a particular form that she was simply not exhibiting. She was tired and scared and furious about a genuine injustice and determined to do something real about it. She was also, and he noted this with the same honesty with which he noted everything about himself, one of the most compelling women he had ever encountered. This was not, he told himself firmly, relevant to the immediate situation. He pushed it to a separate part of his mind and finished his work. Wade Pruitt came to the boarding house at 10 o'clock that night. Andrew knew this because his deputy, a young man named Tom Cressfield who was earnest and reliable, and not yet old enough to be cynical, had been watching the boarding house from a discreet distance since Andrew had sent him there at 8. Tom reported the next morning that Pruitt had knocked on the landlady's door, had spoken to her briefly, and had left with the expressionless face of a man recalibrating his next move. Which meant Hargrove and Pruitt now knew that Beatrice had not done what they had told her to do, and they would be making decisions accordingly. Andrew went to Mrs. Hollis's house at 7 in the morning and found Beatrice already awake and dressed, sitting at Mrs. Hollis's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the carefully controlled expression of a woman who had spent a night cycling through fear and determination and had landed by morning on determination. Mrs. Hollis had clearly pressed the torn hem of her dress with an iron and done something practical to her hair, and the bruise on her jaw was more visible in the daylight but somehow less alarming than it had seemed the night before, which was a function, Andrew understood, of seeing her in a context where she was clearly not broken. "Prute went to the boarding house last night," he told her, sitting down across from her at the table while Mrs. Hollis moved around the kitchen with the diplomatic efficiency of a woman who was present without being intrusive. "He knows you didn't deliver." Beatrice wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "What does that mean for the timeline?" "It means they'll move faster," he said, "which is actually useful to us. When people move fast, they make mistakes." He paused. "I sent a wire to the Federal Land Office this morning. I've also spoken to Judge Elliott, who has his circuit here through Friday. He's seen your notes and document copies, and he's prepared to issue arrest warrants based on what you've provided." Beatrice looked at him steadily. "That was fast." "You did the hard work months ago," he said. "The documentation you collected is substantial enough that the legal process moves quickly once it starts." He held her gaze. "I need you to understand that there's going to be a period between now and when those warrants are executed where you're at risk. Hargrove and Prute are going to figure out very quickly that you went to the law. They might try to run. They might try to destroy evidence. They might try to do something about you." "I understand," she said. "Do you have anywhere you could go outside of Coldwater Creek? Family, friends, somewhere that isn't connected to this situation?" "No," she said, and said it simply, without self-pity, just stating the fact. He nodded. "Then you'll stay with Mrs. Hollis for now. I'm going to have Tom watching the street." He paused. "I'm going to need you to be available to speak with the federal marshal when he arrives, likely Thursday or Friday. Your testimony, combined with the documentation, is what turns this from a collection of papers into a prosecutable case." "I'll be here," she said. "I'm not running." He looked at her across Mrs. Hollis's kitchen table in the plain morning light, and he felt something that he recognized as respect in its deepest and most uncomplicated form. "No," he said. "I didn't think you would be." The next 2 days moved with the specific tension of a situation that is building toward an inevitable confrontation, the way the air feels in the hour before a major storm when the wind drops and the light changes and every living thing goes quiet. Beatrice stayed at Mrs. Hollis's house and, at Mrs. Hollis's quiet insistence, helped with the laundry work, partly for the practical shelter of routine and partly because Mrs. Hollis, who had built a life and a business in a frontier town through sheer force of competence and will, was unexpectedly wonderful company. Mrs. Hollis had come to Coldwater Creek 8 years ago with her late husband James, who had died of a riding accident 4 years prior. She had built the laundry business herself, and she had done it in a town that was not always welcoming to black business owners. Through a combination of superior work, strategic relationships, and the particular kind of dignity that does not require anyone's permission. She and Beatrice talked while they worked, and the conversations ranged from the practical to the surprisingly deep, and Beatrice found in Mrs. Hollis's company a kind of ease she had not expected. She also found, in those 2 days, that Sheriff Andrew Graves came by Mrs. Hollis's house each morning and evening, ostensibly to update her on the case, and that the updates, while genuine, were accompanied by conversations that extended beyond the purely practical. He would sit at Mrs. Hollis's kitchen table and tell her what was happening with the warrants, the federal marshal's expected arrival, the status of the surveillance on the Hargrove building, and she would ask precise and intelligent questions. And gradually, the conversations would widen to include other things. She learned, over the course of those conversations, that Andrew was from Virginia originally, that he had come west after the war, that he had been with the Virginia infantry, and had come back from Appomattox to a homestead that no longer existed, and a family reduced by the years to his mother, who had died in 1869, and an older brother who had gone to California. That he had drifted west and south through a series of occupations: farm hand, cattle drive worker, one cold and miserable winter as a trapper, before a sheriff in a town in New Mexico had seen something in him that he had not seen in himself, and had given him a deputy's badge and a purpose he had not expected to find. He learned, for his part, that Beatrice had studied at a small women's college in Missouri before her father had determined that education was less practically useful to her than a good marriage, that she had a gift for mathematics and a particular interest in property law that she had pursued in private through books she ordered and kept in a box under the bed Gerald had never looked beneath, that she had named a stray cat Gerald had refused to allow in the house and fed it secretly from the kitchen window for 2 years, which was, Andrew told her with the first fully realized smile she had seen from him, one of the most quietly defiant things he had ever heard. On Wednesday evening, Clara came to Mrs. Hollis's house. She came after dark alone, and she looked frightened in the contained way of someone who is genuinely brave and currently frightened anyway. Beatrice brought her inside, and Mrs. Hollis provided coffee without being asked. "He knows," Clara said. "Hargrove, he knows you went to the sheriff. Prude is saying he's going to handle it before the law can move." She looked at Beatrice. "He told May this afternoon that Miss Sutton was going to have an accident." Andrew was there within 20 minutes of Mrs. Hollis's boy carrying the message to the office. He sat across from Clara and listened to her with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, and Clara, who had clearly not expected to be met with immediate uncondescending competence, visibly steadied herself in his presence. "Will you testify?" Andrew asked her. Clara looked at her hands. "I have a daughter," she said quietly. "She's 8 years old and she's with my sister in Amarillo. The debt I have with Hargrove, he holds it over me. If I testify and he walks free, he will go after my sister and my daughter." "He won't walk free," Andrew said. "Not with what Miss Sutton has given us, not with your testimony added to it." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You're very certain for a man who's dealing with someone like Wade Prude," she said. "I'm certain because I know what I have," he said evenly, "and because I've been doing this long enough to know the difference between a case I can win and one I can't." He paused. "I'm also going to put Tom on a horse tonight to go to Amarillo with a letter for your sister. She and your daughter can be brought here under my protection before this is over." Clara stared at him. Something behind her eyes shifted. "You do that?" she said. "Yes," he said simply. Clara looked at Beatrice then, and the look was complex and quick, and said several things that Clara was too careful to say out loud, and Beatrice felt the warmth of it. "All right," Clara said. "I'll testify." Tom rode for Amarillo that night. The federal marshal arrived Thursday morning, a few hours before he was expected, which was the first thing that made Andrew feel genuinely optimistic about the man. His name was Marshal Edgar Finch, and he was from the Austin office and had been working federal land fraud cases across the territory for several years. He reviewed the documentation with a speed and comprehension that confirmed he knew exactly what he was looking at, interviewed Beatrice for 2 hours with pointed and specific questions that she answered clearly and fully, and at the end of that meeting stood up and shook her hand. "Miss Sutton," he said, "this is probably the cleanest documentation I have seen come out of a non-legal investigation. You did remarkable work. I want to make sure the affected families are made whole," she said. "The ones who paid fraudulent fees, that should be part of any resolution." Finch looked at her appraisingly. "I'll see what can be done," he said. "I'd prefer a commitment," she said pleasantly, and stood her ground. Andrew watched this exchange from across the room with an expression that he was careful to keep neutral, though he felt something in his chest that was undeniably warm. The warrants were issued Thursday afternoon. Hargrove was arrested at his office by Marshal Finch and 2 federal deputies. He went quietly, which surprised no one who had observed that men like Hargrove were essentially cowards operating behind the size of the machinery they had built. Wade Prout was a different matter. Prout was not at the Hargrove office when the warrants were executed. Tom, back from sending Clara's sister the message and having ridden through the night both ways with the particular energy of youth and purpose, had been watching the building and had seen Prout leave an hour before the arrest, moving fast, heading for the livery. By the time Andrew got to the livery, Prout's horse was gone. They tracked him. This was the part of the frontier that was unromantic and exhausting. 3 hours of following a trail through the dry scrub of the panhandle, while the October sun was mercifully cool, and the ground held tracks well. Marshal Finch was with him, and so was Tom and one of the federal deputies, and they found Prout 8 miles east of town, where he had stopped to rest his horse by a dry creek bed, and had apparently decided that he could make the better choice. He had not made the better choice. He had drawn his gun, and there had been a brief exchange that ended with Prout's horse shot out from under him, and Prout himself in the dirt with his arm grazed and his pride significantly damaged. Andrew had made the arrest himself, calmly and without unnecessary force, using the minimum required to get Prout's hands secured behind him, because he had always believed that the way you handled the worst people said something about the quality of what you were protecting. They rode back to Coldwater Creek with Hargrove and Prout in custody, arriving in the late afternoon while the October light was going golden over the storefronts, and the people of the town came out to watch from their porches and doorways. Beatrice was standing outside Mrs. Hollis's house when they came in, and she watched the procession with steady eyes and the particular expression of a woman who had carried something very heavy for a very long time, and was only now beginning to believe that she might be allowed to set it down. Andrew caught her eye as he rode past on his way to the jail, and he did not smile, because the moment was too complex for a simple smile, but he held her gaze for a moment that was its own kind of communication, and then rode on. That evening, when the prisoners were settled and the paperwork was begun, and Tom was delegated to keep watch, Andrew walked over to Mrs. Hollis's house for what became the least official and most consequential conversation he'd had in years. He knocked at the door and Mrs. Hollis opened it and gave him the particular look of a woman who understands exactly what is happening and has decided to be helpful, then told him Beatrice was in the back garden. He found her sitting on a low bench under the thin-leafed desert willow tree that Mrs. Hollis had somehow coaxed to grow in the dry Texas soil, her hands loose in her lap, and her face turned up to the evening sky where the first stars were beginning to show. She heard his footsteps and looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her expression do something quiet and open. He sat down on the bench beside her, not too close but not far either. They sat for a moment without speaking, and the evening sounds of Coldwater Creek went on around them, a dog somewhere, the distant voices of the saloon, a horse being settled in a stable, all the sounds of a living town at the end of an ordinary day. "It's over?" she asked. "The immediate part," he said. "The legal process will take time. There'll be a trial. You'll need to be available to testify." He paused. "Where were you planning to go, after tonight, I mean, when this is resolved?" She considered the question. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I came here because of the advertisement. I stayed because of the case. I hadn't really thought past the case." "What would you want," he asked, "if you were thinking about it?" She turned to look at him. He was watching the sky too, in that way he had of giving a person space by looking slightly away while still being entirely present. "I'd want work," she said. "Real work, something that uses what I'm actually capable of." She paused. "And I'd want to stay somewhere long enough for it to feel like a place rather than a stop on a road." "Coldwater Creek could use a land records officer," he said. "The legitimate kind. The town clerk's been managing it on top of everything else for 2 years and doing a poor job because he's got too much else to manage." He paused, and the pause had a quality she was beginning to recognize, the pause of a man being deliberate with words that matter to him. I might have mentioned to Mayor Dunning yesterday that such a position would make sense. She looked at him fully now. He turned to meet her eyes. You'd want me to stay, she said. I would, he said, and said it simply and without hedging. The evening was very quiet around them suddenly, or perhaps the sounds of the town were still there, and they had simply both stopped hearing them. Andrew, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she watched what it did to his face, the small, real change in it, and felt something in herself correspondingly shift. I want to be very clear with you about something. All right, he said. I have been married, she said, and it was not good. I'm not afraid of men in general, but I am very careful about the ones I trust, and I trust very few of them because I have learned what the wrong kind of trust costs. She held his gaze. You have been, in these last few days, exactly the person you appeared to be in the first 5 minutes I met you. That is rare enough that it means something important to me. It should mean something, he said. It should mean exactly that much. What I'm saying, she said, is that I'm not inclined to be careless, but I'm also not inclined to be a coward. The corner of his mouth moved in that near smile that she had learned was his full one, that the wider expression some men wore constantly was to him a performance, and this small, real movement was the genuine article. I'm not a patient man by nature, he said, but I'm a careful one. And I have no interest in rushing anything that I want to last. She looked at him for a moment longer, then turned back to the sky where the stars were properly out now, the vast, indifferent, beautiful canopy of the Texas Panhandle sky. All right then, she said. They sat together under Mrs. Hollis's desert willow as the evening settled into full night, and talked about things that had nothing to do with the case, and things that had everything to do with who they each were. And by the time Mrs. Hollis came to the back door to tell them there was fresh coffee, something between them had been established that was quiet and sure and very, very solid. The trial of Calvin Hargrove and Wade Pruitt took place in the county seat 40 miles south of Coldwater Creek, 3 weeks later, in the first week of November 1878. Beatrice traveled there with Andrew and Tom and Clara, who had been reunited with her daughter and her sister, and whose quiet relief at that reunion had been one of the most moving things Beatrice had witnessed in a long time. The trial itself was not dramatic in the way of the dime novels, which made it sound as though frontier justice was always a matter of shouted accusations and theatrical revelation. It was methodical and procedural and slow in the way that genuine legal proceedings are, and Beatrice found that she did not mind the slowness because she understood its purpose. Hargrove's defense attorney was competent but not brilliant, and the documentation Beatrice had assembled was, as Marshall Finch had said, exceptionally clean. Every claim she made on the witness stand was supported by physical evidence in the form of her document copies, and corroborated by Clara's testimony. She was on the stand for the better part of a day, and Andrew watched from the gallery with an expression of focused calm that she found, glancing at him occasionally, genuinely steadying. He watched her the way she imagined a person watched something they were proud of, not possessively, but with a quiet and genuine investment that was its own kind of warmth. Hargrove was convicted on 8 counts of fraud. Pruitt was convicted on fraud charges and the additional charge of criminal threatening, for which the bruised evidence on Beatrice's jaw was documented and presented with a precision that gave her quiet satisfaction. The restitution order, which Beatrice had advocated for directly with Marshall Finch, and which Finch had made sure was included in the government's recommendations to the court, required Hargrove to repay all fraudulently collected fees. It would be years in the execution, but the legal mechanism was in place. Coming out of the courthouse into the thin November sunshine, Beatrice stopped on the steps and stood for a moment just breathing, the way a person does when they have been carrying a heavy weight and have finally, genuinely, been permitted to put it down. She felt the sun on her face, and she thought about 42 families and probably more, out on their parcels of panhandle land, who would receive letters in the coming months telling them that the fees they had paid were being returned, and that the fraudulent filings against their claims were being resolved. Andrew came to stand beside her on the steps, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool November air. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Like it mattered," she said. "Like what I did actually mattered." "It did," he said. "It will keep mattering for a long time after today." She looked at him. He was looking out at the street, the courthouse square, the people going about their Tuesday lives in a small Texas county seat. His profile was clean and serious in the November light. "Andrew," she said. "Take me to supper," she said. "Not as a witness being debriefed, not as a case being managed. Take me to supper as a man who has just sat through a very long trial and would like to have dinner with a woman he is interested in." He turned to look at her then, and the full smile came, the real one, wider than she had seen it before, and it changed his face in a way that made her heart do something completely unlawyerly. "Mrs. Ellerman's dining room," he said. "They do a roast chicken that is the best thing I've eaten in 3 years." "Perfect," she said. They had supper at Mrs. Ellerman's, and then they had coffee, and then they walked through the streets of the county seat in the dark November evening for an hour before they had to return to the hotel where the Coldwater Creek party was staying, and during the walk Andrew took her hand. Not suddenly or dramatically, but in the natural way of emotion that had simply become the right thing to do, and she let him, and they walked hand in hand through the quiet streets of a small Texas town and talked about things they each cared about. And it was, Beatrice thought, the most straightforwardly happy she had been in longer than she could clearly remember. They returned to Coldwater Creek the next day, and life resumed its shape, though the shape had shifted in ways that mattered. Beatrice accepted the land records officer position that Mayor Dunning offered her, and she moved out of Mrs. Hollis's house into a proper room at the boarding house, the one vacated by her previous stay there, when Prout's threat had made it unsafe, and which the landlady Mrs. Farr gave her at a fair rate, and with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had been unhappy about the Hargrove operation on her street, and was pleased to see its representative replaced by someone better. Clara took work at the general store and stayed in Coldwater Creek with her daughter Alice, who was 8 years old, and immediately adopted Mrs. Hollis as a supplementary grandmother, with the efficiency of a child who knows a good thing when she sees it. May, the quiet girl who had never met anyone's eyes, turned out to have family in Kansas City, and Marshall Finch arranged her passage home, and Beatrice wrote her a letter that May later told Clara, in a letter Clara read aloud one evening at Mrs. Hollis's kitchen table, was the first piece of correspondence she had received in years that treated her like a person with a future. Beatrice set about the land records office with the focused energy of a woman who has found her purpose, and within 2 months she had reorganized the filing system, implemented a consistent protocol for recording new claims, and identified 3 additional irregularities from the Hargrove period that were resolved through the legal process already underway. She also, quietly and on her own time, assembled a simplified guide to the homesteading claim process, written in plain language, which she had printed at the newspaper office and distributed free of charge at the general store, the post office, and the churches. The guide was translated into German by one of the German immigrant families who had settled 12 miles east of town, and who came to Beatrice's office one afternoon with their hats in their hands to thank her, and she had felt, at that moment, something so uncomplicated and so full that she had had to look at her papers for a moment before she trusted her expression. Andrew came by the land records office every day. Some days it was official business, a claim that needed verification, a question about a filing. Most days it was not, and the fiction of official business was maintained briefly and then dispensed with, and they would talk over cups of coffee that the office's small iron stove kept adequate through the December cold. He brought her things sometimes, a book from the stock that occasionally came in with the general store's orders, once a small jar of honey from a beekeeper homesteader who had pressed it on him in gratitude for some service. Once, in an act of such endearing practicality that she had to work hard to keep her face composed, a pair of good leather-work gloves, because he had noticed that the office's wood stove required her to carry fuel in from outside, and her hands were getting rough from the cold. She gave him things too. She mended his coat where the lining had come loose at the shoulder because she noticed it and had the skill, and he had clearly been meaning to do it for several weeks. She copied out a passage from a book on constitutional law that she thought he would find useful and left it on his desk. She told him, one evening in early December when they were walking together after supper, something about the worst year of her marriage that she had never told anyone before, and he listened to it with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. And when she finished, he did not offer platitudes or sympathy of the reflexive kind, but simply held her hand more firmly and said, "You deserved much better than that," in a tone that acknowledged the fullness of what she had described. She cried briefly. He let her, without making it into a crisis. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment. "Don't be," he said. "I don't generally cry," she said. "I know," he said, and somehow he did know, and the recognition in his voice was exactly the right kind of gentle. They became, over the course of that winter, the kind of couple that a small town both notices and claims, the topic of warm and unsurprised conversation at the general store, and the church and Mrs. Hollis's kitchen table, where Mrs. Hollis expressed her opinions on the matter with the particular brevity and accuracy of a woman who had seen a great deal and did not need to elaborate. Andrew asked her to marry him in February of 1879. He did it in the Land Records Office, which was where he had come to associate her most essentially, where she was most completely herself, surrounded by her orderly files and her meticulous maps, and the small vase of dried winter grass she had put on the windowsill because she liked to have something living in the room. He did not make a production of it. He simply came in one afternoon with 2 cups of coffee and set them on the desk and said, when she looked up from her papers, "Beatrice, I want to marry you. I want it more than I've wanted anything in a long time, and I think you might want it too, but I would rather ask you directly than assume." She looked at him across the desk that she had claimed as her own, in the office that was genuinely hers in the town that had become, against all initial expectation, the place she belonged. "Yes," she said. "Yes, you want to marry me," he said. "Or yes, you want to confirm that you might want it too." She laughed, which was the answer. They were married in April of 1879, 6 months after she had walked through the door of his office in a torn dress with a secret that could have gotten her killed, and the absolute determination to do something real about it. The wedding was at the Presbyterian church, the one on the north side of town, because Reverend Marsh had performed the ceremony at a friend's wedding 2 years prior, and both Andrew and Beatrice had independently admired his approach, which was sincere and not overlong. Mrs. Hollis made the wedding cake, a 3-layer affair with honey frosting that was discussed admiringly in Coldwater Creek for weeks afterward. Clara was Beatrice's only attendant, and her daughter Alice sat in the front pew with Mrs. Hollis and wore a white ribbon in her hair, and was, by general consensus, the most well-behaved 8-year-old in the history of the territory. Tom Cressfield served as Andrew's man, a role he performed with the touching seriousness of a young man who has been given a responsibility he intends to honor fully. The wedding itself was, like everything Andrew Graves did, genuine and without unnecessary performance. He said his vows looking directly at Beatrice in a way that made the whole congregation feel they were witnessing something true, and she said hers looking back at him in a way that conveyed everything she had learned about the difference between making a promise and meaning one. Afterward, there was a reception in the church hall that lasted until well past dark and involved dancing of the vigorous frontier variety that left everyone happy and exhausted. Beatrice danced with Andrew and with Tom, and with Mayor Dunning, who was surprisingly light on his feet, and with a homesteader named Friedrich, whose wife had translated the claims guide into German, and who danced with the specific joy of a man who has built something real on solid ground. Andrew danced with Clara and with Mrs. Hollies and with little Alice, which was more accurately described as Andrew standing still, while Alice danced around him to general delight. They rode out to Andrew's house, which was a proper house 2 miles from town that he had built in stages over 3 years, on a night that was cool and clear and full of the particular stars of the Texas panhandle, which were, in Beatrice's honest opinion, among the most beautiful things she had seen in her life. The house had 4 rooms and a covered porch and a garden plot that had been somewhat neglected, and which Beatrice looked at in the darkness and thought about with a quiet and anticipatory pleasure that surprised her with its warmth. Andrew carried her across the threshold in the traditional fashion, which she pretended to find ridiculous and actually found entirely charming, and the house that had been his became theirs in the way that a space becomes shared, not by the legal transfer of it, but by the presence of 2 people in it who belong to each other and to themselves, and who have, finally, both found the place where those things coexist. The year that followed was the first fully happy year of Beatrice Sutton Graves's adult life, and she knew it for what it was even while she was living it, which is a rarer thing than it sounds. She kept the Land Records Office, which she had genuinely come to love. Andrew kept the sheriff's office, which he was genuinely good at. They built a life with the specific texture of 2 capable people who have each survived enough to know what they want, and are not inclined to waste time wanting it timidly. She planted the garden in spring, and it flourished in a way that surprised her with its exuberance, tomatoes and beans and the sweet corn that Andrew ate with the unguarded enthusiasm of a man who has been feeding himself frontier food for too many years. He fixed the fence around it with Tom's help one Saturday in May, and she brought them lunch at noon and sat on the porch steps watching them work, and felt something that she identified, without self-consciousness, as contentment. Andrew built shelves for her books in the front room, making a careful job of it over 3 evenings, measuring twice and using the good wood he had been saving for something he hadn't found the right use for yet. The shelves, once filled, made the front room feel like a room in which actual human beings lived rather than a space that was merely occupied, and he looked at them with the particular satisfaction of a man who has built something useful for someone he loves. She got a cat. This was not discussed so much as executed, in the way that certain decisions are made by people who know their own minds. The cat was a gray and white barn cat of uncertain ancestry and absolute confidence in her own authority, who arrived via Mrs. Hollies, who had acquired 2 kittens from a neighboring homestead and needed to place one. Beatrice named the cat Precedent, which made Andrew laugh with genuine delight, and Precedent settled into the house with the air of a being who had always been expected and had simply been waiting for the invitation. In the fall of 1879, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant. She told Andrew in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, which felt, given the significance of the Tuesday on which they had met, like a pleasing symmetry. He sat very still for a moment when she told him, with the expression of a man receiving something so large that the ordinary machinery of expression takes a moment to catch up. Then he stood up and crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her and held her with the careful and complete intensity of a person holding something they understand is precious, and she put her forehead against his shoulder and felt the strong, steady beat of his heart. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm more than all right," she said. "Good," he said, and his voice had that quality it sometimes had when he meant something more than the words could quite carry. She was, as she had suspected she might be, an organized and clear-headed pregnant woman who refused to be managed, and who continued working at the Land Records Office until 3 weeks before the baby was born, when Mrs. Hollies and Clara, mounted a joint campaign of gentle insistence that finally resulted in Beatrice agreeing to delegate the daily operations to the assistant she had trained, a young man named Josiah, who had the required combination of orderliness and genuine interest in the work. The baby was a boy, born in the early morning hours of May of 1880, attended by the town's Dr. and Mrs. Hollies, who had assisted at enough births in her life to be genuinely useful rather than merely present. He was healthy and loud and had, from the first moments of his life, an expression of determined inquiry that Beatrice said was clearly hereditary, and Andrew said was obviously from her side. They named him James Edwin Graves, the James for Mrs. Hollies' late husband, which was a decision Beatrice had made privately months earlier and proposed to Andrew one evening, and which he had received with the particular warmth of a man who recognizes a right thing when he hears it. The Edwin was for Andrew's father, who had been, by Andrew's account, a decent and hard-working man who had not deserved what the war had done to his family. Mrs. Hollies came to see James Edwin on his second day of life, and held him with the practiced ease of a woman who has held many babies and the specific tenderness of one who has been given an honor she understands fully. She looked at the name on the paper that Beatrice had written out and pressed her lips together in a way that said everything that needed to be said. Little James Edwin grew in the way of healthy, well-loved babies in a house that was full of warmth and the quiet particular music of two people who like each other in addition to loving each other, which is, as anyone who has seen both versions knows, a different and more sustainable thing. Clara's situation improved steadily through 1879 and into 1880. The restitution process from the Hargrove case had moved slowly but genuinely, and the debt that Hargrove had used to coerce her was legally voided as part of the fraud resolution. She had saved enough from the general store work to move into her own small house on the western edge of Coldwater Creek, a two-room place with a yard where Alice could keep chickens, which Alice did with the dedicated enthusiasm of a 9-year-old who has been given real responsibility. Clara joined the women's sewing circle at the Presbyterian Church and became, in the way of capable and resilient people finding their footing, a genuine presence in the community. The Hargrove trial's restitution process also resulted, by the summer of 1880, in 37 of the 42 families Beatrice had identified receiving repayment of their fraudulently collected fees, a number that the Territorial Land Office described in a letter to Mayor Dunning as exceptional given the typical resolution rate for such cases. The remaining 5 had complications related to the underlying claim disputes that took longer to resolve, but Beatrice, who monitored the process from her land records office with the attention of a woman who has a personal stake in the outcome, saw all 5 resolved by the following year. She noted each resolution in a small private ledger that she kept in her desk drawer and put a single careful mark beside each name when it was done. And when the last one was completed, she sat for a moment with her hand on the closed ledger and felt the particular satisfaction of a finished thing. Tom Cressfield, who had ridden to Amarillo and back in a single night and tracked Pruitt across 8 miles of panhandle scrub and stood up in a county courthouse and testified with admirable clarity, was appointed to a deputy position with an increase in salary that Andrew had negotiated with the county in terms that made it clear he considered it non-negotiable. Tom turned 21 in the spring of 1880 and promptly fell in love with the daughter of the German homesteader Friedrich, a young woman named Hannah who had come to America at 15 and had the particular combination of softness and underlying iron that the frontier produced in women who lasted there. Andrew performed their marriage ceremony in July of 1880, having been authorized to do so by the county in his official capacity, and did it with the same sincerity that characterized everything he did, while Beatrice watched from the front pew with James Edwin on her lap and the warm, specific happiness of a woman who knows she is at home. The winter of 1880 was hard in the Texas panhandle, as winters sometimes were. A blizzard in January lasted 3 days and left the town of Coldwater Creek buried to the windowsills and the surrounding homesteads isolated and anxious. Andrew and Tom organized the relief efforts, checking on the closest homesteads by horse and then by foot when the snow was too deep for horses, and Beatrice managed the supplies and communication from the town end with the same organizational precision she brought to the land records office, keeping track of which homesteads had been checked and which were still outstanding and what supplies were needed and where they could be sourced. Mrs. Hollis's laundry building became a warming station and Beatrice coordinated the food distribution from it. And at the end of 3 days, when the storm broke and the sky came out brilliant and hard and blue as a gem, and every homestead in a 20-mile radius had been accounted for, and no one had died of exposure, the town of Coldwater Creek had the slightly dazed satisfaction of a community that has survived something together and knows it. Beatrice stood on the porch of the sheriff's office that evening, James Edwin bundled against her in the carrier Mrs. Hollis had made, looking out at the white-covered street with the remaining gold light of the winter sun making it almost painful in its beauty. Andrew came out and stood behind her and put his arms around both of them, his chin resting against her hair. "It's beautiful," she said. "It is," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her rather than at the street. She smiled at him, and he smiled back. And James Edwin, who had recently discovered that faces were interesting things, and was studying them with the concentration of a small scientist, put one hand up toward Andrew's jaw in a gesture that made both his parents feel something so large it barely had a word for it. "I want to tell you something," Beatrice said. "Tell me everything," Andrew said, and his voice had the warm, private resonance of a shared thing, a reference to the night she had come through that office door in October of 1878, which they had talked about more than once in the way you talk about the hinge points of your life. "I am not leaving." She leaned back into him and looked out at the white and gold street. "I'm happy," she said simply. "I wanted you to know that I'm genuinely, fully happy." He tightened his arms around her and the baby. "So am I," he said. Spring of 1881 brought several new things to Coldwater Creek. The railroad extension that had been speculated about for 2 years was confirmed, which meant the town was going to grow, which meant the land records office was going to get busier, which Beatrice greeted with equanimity, and the practical step of submitting a formal request to the county for an expanded budget and a second assistant. The county, which had learned over the preceding 2 years that Beatrice Sutton Graves's requests were always backed by detailed justification and were never unreasonable, approved the request. It also brought Beatrice's second pregnancy, which she discovered in March and told Andrew about in the same kitchen on a Tuesday morning, because by this point the pattern was established and she had decided she liked it. He stood up and crossed the kitchen exactly as he had before, and she said, against his shoulder, "You're consistent." And he said, against her hair, "I consider that a virtue." This time it was a girl, born in November of 1881, healthy and quiet and possessed, from the earliest days of her life, of a focused attention that her parents recognized immediately as familiar. They named her Margaret Clara Graves, the Margaret for Andrew's mother, the Clara for the woman who had walked into a dark house and done a brave thing, and by doing so had helped bring the whole edifice down. Clara, when told, sat very still for a moment and then said, in the practical tone she used for things that affected her deeply, "That's a good name." Her daughter Alice, now 11 and a serious-minded child who had recently decided she wanted to be a doctor, which Mrs. Hollis supported wholeheartedly, and Clara supported with the specific ferocity of a mother who has survived enough to know that her child's dreams are worth fighting for, was delighted by the baby, and immediately appointed herself an authority on the subject. By 1882, Coldwater Creek had grown. The railroad had brought new settlers and new businesses, and the particular energy of a town that knows it is becoming something. The land records office had expanded to 3 staff members and occupied a larger room in the town hall building, and Beatrice managed it with the assured competence of someone who has built something real and knows how it works. Andrew had been re-elected sheriff in the spring election with such a margin that the vote count was almost perfunctory, the town's way of making a collective statement about trust. The house on the 2-mile road outside town had expanded too. Andrew had added 2 rooms over the course of 1881, working with a builder from the new arrivals whose craftsmanship he respected. And the house was now properly large for a family with a toddler and a baby and a gray and white cat named Precedent, who had established a particular sleeping position in front of the stove that was considered inviolable by everyone including the children. The garden had expanded each year, tended with increasing confidence by Beatrice and increasing chaos by James Edwin, who was 2 years old and had opinions about soil and worms that he communicated in the wordless but entirely emphatic way of toddlers. On a Sunday afternoon in May of 1882, Beatrice sat on the covered porch of their house while Andrew was in the garden with James Edwin, who was investigating a beetle with the total absorption of a small person, encountering something fascinating. The spring light was long and warm across the panhandle landscape, and the air smelled of the blooming thing she had planted along the porch rail, whose name she had had to look up and now always called correctly, mountain laurel. Little Margaret Clara was asleep in the cradle that Andrew had made over a winter month in the evenings, taking his time with the wood the way he took his time with important things. She had a book in her lap, the property law text she was working through for the 3rd time with different specific questions each time, and she was not currently reading it. She was watching her husband crouch in the garden to look at what her son was pointing at, and the scene had a quality of light and peace that she wanted to fix, the way you fix a plant between pages, so that it keeps something of its living self forever. She thought about the woman who had come through the door of the sheriff's office that Tuesday evening in October of 1878, frightened and bruised, and holding a secret that had the weight of a dark past behind it, and the potential for a forced choice between her safety and doing what was right. She thought about what that woman had not known when she walked through that door. That the man on the other side of it would listen as though what she said mattered, which was all she had needed but more than she had expected. That the secret, the terrible thing she had been carrying, would become the thing that changed everything, not in the way of destruction but in the way of building. That the town she had arrived in by accident would become the town that was hers. That she would find in this landscape that had seemed so alien and so harsh the specific quality of home. She thought about all the things she had not known, and she felt the sweet, uncomplicated weight of how much had been built since then. The work and the friendships and the marriage and the children and the house and the garden and the cat named Precedent, who was currently sitting on the porch rail watching Andrew and James Edwin with the expression of a cat who considers all domestic activities beneath her dignity, but finds them moderately interesting. Andrew looked up from the garden and saw her watching him. He smiled, the full real one, and she felt it land in her chest the same way it had the first time she had seen it, on the courthouse steps in the November sunshine of 1878, which was something she would never entirely take for granted because she knew exactly what it had taken to get here. She smiled back. James Edwin, who had finished with the beetle and noticed that his parents were doing the thing where they looked at each other in a way that he had come to associate with being picked up and embraced, came running across the garden on his sturdy 2-year-old legs with his arms already wide open. Andrew caught him and lifted him and came toward the porch with the child against his shoulder, and Beatrice stood to meet them, and the spring afternoon held them in its light with the particular grace of an ordinary day that is, for the people in it, extraordinary. There were more days ahead of them. There were difficult seasons, as there are always difficult seasons. The dry year when the garden failed and the wheat prices collapsed, and the town had to pull together in the particular way communities do when times are genuinely hard. There was the scarlet fever outbreak of 1883 that came through the territory and frightened everyone, and took 3 children from families in the region, which left Beatrice and Andrew holding their own children with a ferocity that was the opposite side of the coin of happiness, the awareness of what love means you are capable of losing. There were cases that Andrew found hard, in the way that men who care deeply about justice find it hard when justice is imperfect or delayed, and nights when he came home with the weight of something he had seen or been unable to prevent, and Beatrice sat with him in the kitchen at the table where they had told each other so much, and simply kept him company in the darkness until the darkness passed. There was the afternoon when James Edwin, at 4 years old, asked his father with the earnest directness of a child who has not learned to be indirect about important things, whether he could have the badge when he grew up. Andrew, with the seriousness that serious questions from children deserve, said that he could have any badge he worked honestly for, and that if he wanted to learn what that meant, they could start by talking about what a badge was actually for. The conversation lasted 2 hours and covered territory that left the child asleep in his chair at the kitchen table, and left Andrew with the particular expression of a man who has been surprised by what he has to teach. There was the day in the summer of 1884 when Beatrice was offered, by letter, a position with the Territorial Land Office in Austin, supervising land records at the territorial level, a position that would have been extraordinary for a woman with her background, and that would have taken her away from Coldwater Creek. She read the letter 3 times. She talked to Andrew about it, thoroughly and honestly, because that was how they did things, and he listened without trying to influence her, and then said that if she wanted it, they would find a way to make it work, that her work mattered and her ambitions mattered, and he would not be the thing that stood between her and what she was capable of. She had sat with that for a week, and at the end of the week she had written back to decline the position, but had proposed instead a consulting arrangement through which she could assist the territorial office in establishing best practices for county land records offices throughout the panhandle, which would allow her to do work of genuine significance without leaving the place and the people she had chosen. The territorial office had accepted. It had become, over the next several years, one of the more meaningful things she had done professionally. There was the quiet December night in 1884 when she and Andrew sat by the stove after the children were asleep, the house settled and warm around them, and she told him, for the first time, the full true story of her marriage to Gerald, the things she had not yet told anyone, the one she had kept behind the final door in herself. He listened the way he always listened, completely and without flinching, and when she was done, the silence held them both for a moment, and then he said, "You were always more than what he was able to see," and she understood that this was not a comfort offered but a true statement plainly made, and she received it as such. There was the spring of 1885 when Clara announced that she was marrying a widowed farmer named Robert Hale, who had a homestead 12 miles east of town, and 2 sons from his first marriage, and a straightforward decency that Clara described as being the first thing she had trusted about him. The wedding was a practical afternoon affair at the Justice of the Peace, followed by a supper at Mrs. Hollis's house that lasted until nearly midnight, and was one of the happiest evenings Beatrice could remember, watching Clara's face across the table, the open, unguarded quality of a woman who has put down a burden and found herself standing on solid ground. Alice, Clara's daughter, who was 15 by then and serious and bright and still determined to be a doctor, had conversations with Beatrice about the women's medical colleges that existed in the eastern states, and Beatrice wrote 3 careful letters of inquiry on Alice's behalf to institutions in Philadelphia and Boston, and Alice sat up late reading the responses with the expression of someone seeing a door open that they had been told was locked. Whether that door would fully open was still in the future, but it was open, and Beatrice believed in leaving doors open. Mrs. Holly's remained, as she had always been, one of the foundational structures of their lives. She was James Edwin's preferred source of story, Margaret Clara's preferred source of baked goods, and Beatrice's most reliable friend and advisor. She was also, as Coldwater Creek grew and changed, an increasingly visible figure in the civic life of the town, her opinion sought and her counsel respected in ways that were sometimes still qualified by the limitations the era placed on black women in public life, which was an injustice she bore with the dignity she brought to everything, and that Beatrice and Andrew both pushed back against in the practical and imperfect ways that people push against the large injustices of their own era. Through specific choices and specific words, and the steady work of treating each person before them as exactly what they were. In 1886, Beatrice was 40 years old and standing on the porch of her house in the spring evening light, which was doing the thing it did in the Texas panhandle when the season turned, going gold and long and almost liquid over the grass that had come up green and abundant after a wet March. She had a cup of coffee in her hands. Margaret Clara, 5 years old, was sitting on the porch steps with a cat and a collection of rocks she had organized by color and size, in a system that she had explained to Beatrice at length, and which demonstrated a classificatory instinct that her mother found entirely recognizable. James Edwin, 6, was somewhere in the back of the property with Andrew, who had taken Saturday afternoons for the past year as the specific time for the kind of long, unstructured, wandering conversation he believed a father owed a son. She could hear their voices occasionally, not the words, just the sound, Andrew's low register and James Edwin's still high one, and the sound of it was a thing she intended to remember. She was thinking about the fact that she had been afraid, once, that happiness was not something she was allowed, or not something that would hold, or not something she could trust herself to build. She had believed, in the years of the marriage and in the tired months afterward, that there was something in her either insufficient or too much that would prevent the ordinary human thing of a life built in warmth with people who mattered. She had been wrong. She thought this simply and without drama. She had been wrong, and she was grateful for it. And she was grateful for the particular route by which she had been proven wrong. That October night and the torn dress and the bruised jaw and the terrible secret she had been carrying and the door she had pushed open because she had run out of other choices. Andrew came around the side of the house with James Edwin on his back and the expression of a man who has been playing a vigorous game of some kind and is not sorry about it. He saw her on the porch, and his face did the thing it did. She stepped down from the porch to meet them. James Edwin launched himself from Andrew's back to hers with the absolute confidence of a child who has never been dropped and does not consider the possibility, and she caught him and laughed and felt the solid, real, remarkable weight of him. And Andrew was right there, his hand warm on her back, and Margaret Clara came up the steps to see what the noise was, trailing 3 rocks and the cat. The evening fell around them all, soft and golden. Everything Beatrice Sutton Graves had built, from the careful notes in the lining of a travel satchel to the children and the house and the garden and the life that hummed with the specific frequency of something genuine, had begun on a Tuesday in October when she had pushed open a door and said, "I need to tell you something," and the man on the other side had said, "Tell me everything. I am not leaving," and he never had.